There is a mountain range that refuses to let go of its people. For thousands of years, the Carpathians have watched empires rise on their slopes and dissolve into their forests. Dacians, Slavs, Saxons, Vlachs, Cumans, Ottomans, Habsburgs, each one leaving something behind that outlived the empire itself. Not a monument. Not a border. A name. A surname is supposed to be a small thing. A label. A convenience for tax collectors and church registries. But researchers working across Central and Eastern Europe have started to notice something stranger. Some of these names are not just old. They are anchors, fragments of a genetic and cultural history that predates the nations built on top of them. And when geneticists began comparing the Y chromosome lineages carried by certain surname groups to the deep ancestral layers of the Carpathian Basin, the results did not simply confirm what genealogists expected. They complicated it. This is the story of 14 surnames scattered across the Carpathian Arc, from the Tatra highlands to the Transylvanian plateau, from Galicia to the Bukovina forests, and what the emerging science of surname-linked DNA suggests they might be quietly preserving. Not a fantasy of noble bloodlines. Something more interesting. A record of who actually stayed, who moved, and who blended, written not in ink, but in inheritance. For most of modern history, surnames in this region were treated as administrative artifacts. Historians assumed they emerged relatively late, in the medieval and early modern periods, when kingdoms and empires needed to track subjects for taxation, conscription, and land ownership. A name like a trade, a village, a father's first name, or a physical trait became fixed across generations largely by bureaucratic necessity, not ancestral meaning. Under this conventional view, a surname tells you almost nothing about deep ancestry. It tells you what a scribe wrote down 4 or 5 centuries ago, and little else. This made sense for a long time. The Carpathian region has been a crossroads for so many peoples. Dacian tribes, Roman colonists, Slavic migrations, Magyar horsemen, German settlers invited by medieval kings, Romanian shepherd communities moving with their flocks along the ridgelines, that most historians assumed any genetic signal would have been thoroughly scrambled centuries ago. A name might reflect the language spoken in a village. It was not expected to reflect who a person's ancestors actually were 10 or 20 generations back. But then researchers studying Y chromosome DNA, the genetic material passed almost unchanged from father to son, started matching surname databases against genetic samples from across the region. And the first thing they noticed did not fit the assumption of total scrambling. Certain surnames, especially those tied to isolated highland villages, showed something unexpected, a striking consistency in paternal lineage markers among unrelated men who happened to share the same family name. In a region assumed to be a genetic blender, some names behaved almost like sealed containers. That was the first crack in the old story. This is where the science had to enter carefully, because Y chromosome DNA and surnames only align under a specific condition, patrilineal surname inheritance, where sons take their father's name generation after generation, largely undisturbed by non-paternity events, adoption, or name changes. In parts of the Carpathians, especially in isolated mountain parishes where the same families intermarried within a narrow valley for centuries, that condition held remarkably well. The Y chromosome, passed almost identically from father to son with only slow mutations accumulating over time, became a kind of hidden ledger. And in some of these communities, that ledger had barely been edited in hundreds of years. Researchers were not just looking at the Y chromosome in isolation. They paired it with autosomal DNA, the broader genetic material inherited from all ancestral lines, not just the paternal one, to see whether these surname-linked lineages also carried distinct ancestral signatures compared to their neighbors. If a name preserved paternal lineage, would it also preserve something in the wider genome? A signature of deeper population history? The answer was not a clean yes. And that is exactly where this stopped being a simple confirmation story. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where the evidence complicates the story instead of simply confirming it, consider subscribing, because there are entire regions of the human past hiding inside details as ordinary as a family name. What the genetic data revealed instead was layered. Some surname groups did carry a coherent, old regional signature, consistent with populations that had lived in the same highland valleys since well before recorded history, possibly tracing back toward early Bronze Age or Iron Age inhabitants of the Carpathian Basin. Other surname groups, despite sounding equally ancient and equally rooted in local language, carried genetic signatures that pointed somewhere else entirely: Pannonian lowland populations, Balkan shepherd migrations, or even signals associated with steppe nomadic groups like the Cumans, who settled in parts of Hungary and Transylvania in the medieval period and were gradually absorbed into the surrounding population. In other words, two men could carry surnames that looked, on paper, equally native to the mountains, and yet one man's paternal line might trace to a population that had occupied that valley for thousands of years, while the others traced to a group that arrived on horseback less than 1,000 years ago and simply adopted the local language, the local name style, and eventually the local identity completely. The old story assumed a name told you where a family had always been. What the DNA suggested instead was that a name often tells you where a family ended up, and that the deeper question of where they came from required a different kind of evidence entirely. At this point, researchers working on Carpathian population genetics have generally proposed a few competing explanations, and it's worth sitting with all of them, because none has been definitively proven over the others. The first is straightforward regional continuity, the idea that certain surname-linked lineages genuinely descend, largely undisturbed, from populations who occupied specific Carpathian valleys since prehistory, with surnames simply crystallizing around families that had already been rooted in place for an extraordinarily long time. The second is what geneticists sometimes call cultural absorption without full genetic replacement, the idea that incoming groups, whether Slavic migrants in the early medieval period or later Cuman and Vlach shepherd communities, settled among existing populations, intermarried over generations, and were gradually folded into the same surname traditions and the same villages, blurring the line between original and arrived, until the distinction becomes almost meaningless. The third is a founder effect within isolated highland communities, small, geographically cut-off populations where a limited number of founding families expanded over centuries into today's surname clusters, meaning the genetic signal reflects a relatively recent bottleneck rather than deep continuous ancestry at all. Each explanation fits some of the data. None fits all of it. And that unresolved tension is, in a strange way, the most honest part of the science. The turning point in this research came when larger, more systematic studies began comparing modern surname-linked samples against a broader genomic panel that included not just neighboring modern populations, but scattered ancient DNA recovered from Carpathian burial sites, remains dating back through the medieval period and, in some cases, into the Iron Age. This mattered enormously, because modern comparisons alone can only tell you who resembles whom today. Ancient DNA lets researchers compare a living surname lineage directly against people who were actually breathing, farming, and dying in those same valleys centuries or millennia earlier. What emerged from these broader comparisons was the most significant finding in this entire body of research. A subset of surname lineages, concentrated in specific highland regions of the Tatra and the southern Carpathian ridgeline, showed genetic continuity with ancient regional remains that predated the arrival of Slavic-speaking populations by a wide margin. These are names that, on the surface, sound entirely typical of medieval Slavic or Romanian naming conventions. But the paternal lineages carried by some of the men bearing them appear to reach back toward a much older regional population, one that existed before the linguistic and cultural identity now associated with that surname ever formed. Here is the twist researchers keep returning to, carefully, because it complicates everything the old story assumed. It was not that these families had foreign or unexpected origins. It was the opposite. The genetic evidence suggested they were more ancient in that specific place than the language, religion, or ethnic identity they now carry. The name is new. The culture wrapped around it is new. But the paternal line underneath may be extraordinarily old enough to have witnessed the very cultural transitions that eventually produced the surname itself. Not a story of unexpected foreign ancestry. A story of unexpected depth in the ancestry that was always assumed to be simple. This matters far beyond 14 surnames or one mountain range, because it forces a rethinking of how identity and ancestry actually relate to one another. We tend to assume that language, ethnicity, and surname all move together through history as a single package, that if a name is Slavic, the ancestry is Slavic. If a name is Vlach, the ancestry is Vlach. What the Carpathian evidence increasingly suggests is that these threads can separate. A community can shift language, adopt new customs, take on an entirely new ethnic identity, while a much older paternal lineage, quietly encoded in the Y chromosome, continues underneath, largely unaware of the labels layered on top of it. Picture the region itself for a moment. High alpine meadows where shepherd trails have been worn into the same paths for centuries. Wooden churches standing in valleys so narrow the sun only reaches the floor for a few hours a day. Villages where, even now, 3 or 4 surnames account for most of the population, and everyone is, in some distant sense, related to everyone else. Snow settling early into the high passes, cutting a hamlet off from its neighbors for months at a time, the kind of isolation that, generation after generation, does not just shape culture. It shapes genomes. Mist gathering low over pastureland at dawn, indifferent to whichever empire happens to claim the valley that century. The mountains do not know about borders. They only know about the families who kept climbing back up them, year after year, century after century, refusing, or simply never needing, to leave. If a story like this makes you look differently at your own family name, you're not alone, and it's worth remembering how many of these questions are still genuinely open. What the research on Carpathian surnames ultimately offers is not a tidy revelation. It is something more honest than that. Scientists remain cautious about overinterpreting any single surname's genetic story, and rightly so. The evidence points toward patterns, not certainties, and the data may indicate deep continuity in some lineages while suggesting complex, layered mixing in others. This does not prove that every man with one of these 14 names descends from a Bronze Age hunter or an Iron Age herder. It complicates the far simpler assumption that a name is just a name, invented conveniently a few centuries ago and carrying nothing older within it. The old map of Carpathian ancestry treated names, languages, and peoples as if they moved through history together, in lockstep, each generation a clean copy of the last. The genome tells a messier and more remarkable story, of populations that stayed while everything around them changed, of names that arrived far more recently than the blood beneath them, of isolated valleys that preserved fragments of human history that written records never thought to record at all. The Carpathians did not simply witness the passage of empires. In the quiet biology of the families who never left, they may have preserved something the empires themselves forgot. The mystery is not finished. It rarely is. But somewhere in those 14 names, carried without ceremony through baptismal records and village registers for hundreds of years, may be one of the oldest continuous threads of human ancestry still living in Europe today, waiting, as it always has, in the mountains that never asked anyone to explain themselves.